If municipal government is the backbone of our communities, the heart is the volunteers who keep things ticking, from fire, ambulance, and emergency management services to recreation, libraries, and senior centers. Many of our volunteers are regarded not only as role models, but also as heroes, and rightly so because of the valuable services they provide. Unfortunately, some volunteer organizations have made headlines for the wrong reasons. They've become subjects of lawsuits dealing in such areas as harassment, discrimination, safety, and violence. These are basic civil rights, and we have a no-tolerance policy against violations and violators. That's where municipal attorneys like myself come into the picture, helping elected officials and professionals deal with these important issues. Please join me as I meet with the town mayor, 2 of his volunteers, a fire chief, and head of the ambulance corps, along with his recreation director, who deals with many volunteers.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming to Town Hall this morning. As you may know, we've had incidents of wrongdoing in the workplace in many parts of the state. Such incidents are unacceptable, and I thought it would be helpful to have the municipal attorney talk to us about precautions we need to take.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to be here. To begin understanding this issue, you need to know that volunteers have many of the same rights and responsibilities as governmental employees. Federal and state laws cover such important areas as discrimination, safety, violence, and harassment. To protect you, the community has a no-tolerance policy towards these violations of basic civil rights.
I really appreciate you coming to this meeting. My members are very concerned about their personal legal liability. We put our lives on the line every time we go to a fire, and we thought, as volunteers, we couldn't be sued.
My members have the same concern. When you're called out at 3 in the morning, you don't want to be thinking about legal liability.
I completely understand. While as a volunteer you enjoy many legal protections, volunteers can be sued if they violate someone's civil rights. That's a whole different area of the law. There are no immunities or exemptions in civil rights.
Isn't this covered by the insurance?
Well, as much as legally possible, but under law, insurance often cannot cover the punitive damages awarded when someone deliberately and knowingly violates someone else's civil rights. In other words, you can be held personally liable. A lot of these problems can be avoided by just using some basic common sense.
I'm confused here. When we talk about civil rights, aren't we talking about employment issues? Our organizations use volunteers. We don't have employees.
Under law, the prohibition against employment discrimination based on such factors as gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, national origin, or age also extends to volunteers in organizations that receive any support from the government or that use governmental facilities such as the ball fields. In other words, for many purposes, the law treats volunteers as employees.
So does that mean that if a recreation league rejects town funds, it doesn't have to worry about these types of lawsuits?
You'd still be subject to most of these laws anyway. The reality is that the public and the courts take civil rights very seriously. You can't just run roughshod over someone else's civil rights.
I understand that some fire companies are independent of the town because they own the firehouse.
Even then, they're subject to the civil rights laws. Further, they're not exactly independent because they're structured as charitable trusts and, under some circumstances, are still legally accountable to the town.
I don't understand. Can't volunteer organizations establish their own membership rules?
Only to a point. If a volunteer applies for membership in a volunteer organization that receives government support, he or she has almost the same rights as an applicant for a governmental job. As a condition for public support, an organization cannot be a closed club. Membership rules cannot be discriminatory based on factors such as gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, national origin, or age.
In other words, we have to take everyone who applies.
Oh, that's not what I said. You can establish membership requirements based on realistic requirements, just as if you were hiring employees to run the ambulance company. However, you must be careful to administer these requirements in a non-discriminatory way.
For example?
Well, you can't give preference to, say, the mayor's brother-in-law.
That's a relief. Now I can get him off my back.
Well, what if someone with disabilities applies for membership?
You're also subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act. If someone with disabilities applies, you have a duty to enter into a good faith discussion about reasonable accommodations, just as if the individual was applying for a job. The key is the good faith dialogue.
For many of our organizations, the issue isn't accepting members because we can't get enough volunteers. Rather, the big question is discipline.
Absolutely. This is also true with career firefighters. The point is that volunteers and employees have their same responsibilities as well as the same protections from arbitrary discipline and dismissal.
What does this mean in practical terms?
It means that members charged with violating rules must be given a fair hearing. Rules must be applied consistently. Just as in an employment situation, leaders of volunteer organizations are well advised to talk to an attorney before proceeding with major disciplinary actions.
You're right about that. Too often, petty squabbles build to a big feud, and before long, the department is tied up for years in lawsuits. Much of this can be avoided if we just slow down and let cooler heads prevail.
To shift the subject slightly, I notice in the paper that many of these suits also involve complaints that someone was harassed.
Yes, that's right. Harassment lawsuits have increased substantially because most people are no longer willing to tolerate bad behavior. At one time, someone who was the target of jokes or other intimidating conduct just had to take it. No more.
It's important that we communicate this to everyone involved in the town's organization. Under no circumstances make jokes, use nicknames, or pick on someone based on their race, religion, national origin, age, disability, gender, or sexual orientation.
Come on. There's nothing wrong with a little give and take now and then.
The problem is you never know when the line is crossed and the jokes become offensive.